What do you call a world where silence is more dangerous than war? Where the deadliest weapons aren't missiles, but contracts, debt traps, and silent handshakes behind closed doors? Where justice doesn't die in gunfire, but in quiet rooms where no one dares to speak? At exactly 4 a.m, the skies over Tehran exploded, not with the light of dawn, but with war. The world watched in silence. But, in a modest office, thousands of kilometers away, one man rose to his feet, not out of fear, but because he understood this was the moment to speak truth. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, president of a small West African nation with no nuclear bombs, no seat at the UN Security Council, had something far more powerful clarity. Because while bombs rained down in Iran, Burkina Faso was burning in silence. Not with fire, but with manipulation, debt, disinformation, and a world too polite to care. This is not just a story about Iran. This is a warning to every small nation and every voiceless people. Share this video not just because it needs to be seen, but because you are speaking for those who cannot. Do you believe in our Traoré? Do you believe that when one man stands for truth, God listens and shields him? I do. And if you do too, then do not stay silent. Tehran did not sleep that night. Neither did the world. Israel called it Operation Rising Lion, a name chosen not just for symbolism, but for dominance. In a single night, dozens of Iranian nuclear facilities were erased. Natanz, Isfahan, names long whispered in international briefings, now reduced to dust and cratered silence. Jets flew deep. Drones swarmed. Entire military installations vanished before the sun could rise. And as fire lit the Iranian skyline, another light went out: global restraint. There was no warning, no vote, no sanctions, just action. And in that moment something shifted. Traoré was watching, not just the missiles, but the silence that followed. No urgent press conferences from world leaders. No emergency measures from the United Nations. Just statements, careful, vague, forgettable. De-escalation, national security. Words that mean everything and nothing. The world had watched one sovereign nation strike another unprovoked, and said nothing. And in that silence, Traoré heard something louder than explosions. The death of international law. For years, small nations were told, wait for diplomacy. Trust the process. Peace takes time. But now the rules had changed. Power had a new language, and it spoke in missiles. Traoré turned from the screen and asked only one question. If this can happen to them, what stops it from happening to us? He was not defending Iran. He was defending a principle. Because when global order collapses for one, it begins to collapse for all. While missiles lit up the Middle East, a different kind of war raged in West Africa. No sirens, no satellite images, no breaking news banners. But for Ibrahim Traoré, the threat was just as real, perhaps more dangerous. Because this war didn't drop bombs, it dropped narratives. It didn't send jets, it sent bank wires. It didn't arrive with uniforms. It arrived with suits, contracts, and encrypted deals. Burkina Faso was under attack, not from the sky, but from the shadows. Fake protests with banners printed abroad. Social media campaigns funded by invisible hands. Partners offering aid, but with strings tied around the nation's neck. Supplies appeared from nowhere. Alliances shifted overnight, not out of belief, but out of bribes. And when Traoré pushed back, when he named names, when he dared to say the truth out loud, they didn't call him brave. They called him dangerous. The same world that praised preemptive strikes against Iran now told Burkina Faso to calm down, to dialogue, to show restraint. A double standard, a silent colonialism, one that doesn't need to invade, it just needs to manipulate. And Traoré knew if silence greeted Israel's missiles, then no one would speak up when Africa falls without a sound. If the world only sees war when missiles fall, what happens to the nations being dismantled in silence? While the world normalized chaos, Ibrahim Traoré began to dismantle it. Not with missiles, not with threats, but with something far more dangerous to empire clarity. Because when silence becomes a weapon, truth becomes the only form of defense. And in Burkina Faso, truth had been suffocating for decades, hidden under development deals, hollow aid packages, and smiling envoys with poisoned intentions. So Traoré acted. He rewrote military codes overnight, dismissed officers hand-picked by foreign consultants, replaced entire command chains with loyalists who understood this was no longer a peacetime army. Not because of bombs, but because of betrayal. He ended secret partnerships, cut ties with banks and financial institutions whose support came with conditions that mortgaged the future of his people, expelled organizations that operated more like surveillance arms than civil partners, and when the media cried foul, he answered with 3 words: "Burkina is ours." These weren't random purges, they were acts of survival. In a world where manipulation is disguised as diplomacy, transparency becomes the only rebellion. But Traoré did not stop there. He went to the people not with empty slogans but with hard truths. He told them your enemy may not wear a uniform, it may wear a smile. It may fund your roads while burying your voice. He didn't ask them to prepare for war. He asked them to see clearly. That was his revolution. Because sovereignty is not something you claim with flags. It is something you protect policy by policy, principle by principle. And Traoré knew if they didn't defend it now, piece by piece, it would be stolen piece by piece. Across the continent, his defiance sent shockwaves. Some called him mad, others whispered finally. But the ones who mattered most, the people, began to awaken, not in protest, but in posture. Shoulders lifted, eyes sharpened, as if the fog that had cloaked their history for decades had finally begun to lift. Traoré reminded them that colonialism never really left. It just changed clothes, and if they didn't resist the version with suits and spreadsheets, it would return with tanks when they were weak. He declared, "We will not copy empires built on fear. We will build a nation rooted in dignity." And then the most radical thing of all, he stopped asking for permission. No more waiting for foreign approval. No more signing deals to be liked. No more softening speeches for donor agencies. He stood before his people not as a puppet, but as a prophet. And he asked a question that echoed across the Sahel. Do you believe in the power of your own voice? Because if they did, if they believed even a little, then it would no longer matter who tried to silence them. And it was then, and only then, that he invoked God. Not in desperation, but in alignment. He said, if we speak for truth, God will shield us. If we walk in dignity, we walk under his watch. He was not building a cult. He was breaking a curse. The curse of depending on those who fed your hunger while chaining your future. And as the international community raised eyebrows, threatened sanctions, whispered coups, Traoré simply smiled. He had chosen clarity over comfort, conviction over compromise, courage over compliance. And most of all, he had chosen to believe that God does not bless nations who kneel to lies. He blesses those who stand for truth even alone. And so he stood, one man, against the tide, with no bombs, no navy, just a voice, and a people who were beginning to believe again, because Traoré knew something many forgot. The world doesn't need more power, it needs more prophecy. Peace is no longer defined by the absence of war. It is measured by the presence of obedience. And in this new world, order silence has become the currency of survival. Traoré understood that better than most. He had seen how nations were punished not for aggression, but for disobedience. Say no to extraction, you're unstable. Call out foreign interference, you're radical. Protect your sovereignty, you're dangerous. This wasn't just politics, it was theology, a gospel of fear preached by nations who worship stability over justice, a religion where the God is prophet and the devil is any country that dares to think for itself. And yet, Traoré refused to kneel, because he knew the first sin of small nations is silence. Silence when your elections are manipulated. Silence when your children are educated to hate their own history. Silence when your minerals leave richer than your people ever will. He said, a country that does not speak is not a country, it is a colony with a flag. So he spoke, loudly, clearly, spiritually, and what he spoke shook the foundations of quiet empires. Because truth, when spoken from the mouth of the oppressed, does not just echo, it convicts. He reminded the world that sovereignty without dignity is still slavery, and that no amount of infrastructure can replace the power of self-definition. Traoré looked around and saw Africa not as a victim, but as a sleeping lion, one that had forgotten its roar, not because of defeat, but because of deception. He said, they did not chain our hands, they chained our imagination. But now, something was changing. Young people were quoting him. Mothers were praying for him. Fathers were saying, maybe we were not wrong to dream. He was not just a man. He was becoming a mirror that reflected both the scars and the possibility. And in that reflection, the world began to panic, because if one nation could defy the script, others might follow. So the tools of silence were sharpened. Editorials calling him reckless. Leaked reports claiming instability. International observers concerned about democracy. Aid agencies hinting at suspension. Embassies updating travel advisories. But Traoré smiled. Because he knew something simple and terrifying to his enemies, he wasn't alone anymore. Across the continent, whispers turned to conversations. Conversations turned to movement. Not armed revolution, but mental insurrection. From Mali to Niger, from Congo to Guinea, a question was rising. If we own the soil, why don't we own the story? This was the true revolution. Not against foreign armies, but against internalized inferiority. Traoré said, the worst colonizer is the one you carry in your mind. And for the first time in decades, young Africans were not dreaming of escape. They were dreaming of building, not to copy Europe, not to beg China, but to become sovereign in the truest sense, spirit, mind, policy, and voice. And this scared the world far more than missiles ever could. Because missiles destroy buildings, but vision, it dismantles empires. That is why Traoré was targeted not with weapons, but with narratives, to paint him as extreme, to isolate him, to turn his own people against him. But he answered not with paranoia, but with prayer. He said, I am not asking to be liked. I am asking to be free. And if I must choose between applause and clarity, I choose God. And in that declaration, he touched something sacred. The belief that freedom is not granted, it is affirmed, not by empires, not by algorithms, but by people who remember they were born whole. So now the question is no longer, will Burkina Faso survive? It is, will the world survive the truth? Burkina Faso is forcing it to face when the last missile falls and the cameras go quiet. What remains? Not just ashes, not just statistics, but a question that echoes in every small nation's soul. What are we building? Because if silence can justify a strike, if power can override process, if justice can be paused for convenience, then the world is not drifting into darkness, it is sprinting. But Ibrahim Traoré chose another path. He did not run from the storm, he walked into it, not with weapons, not with applause, but with one dangerous thing: conviction. He reminded us that peace is not passive, it is an act of defiance, against fear, against forgetfulness, against the slow death of dignity through diplomatic delay. He knew that Burkina Faso may not stop global wars, but it could refuse to normalize them. It could refuse to mimic them. It could build a country that does not need to beg to exist. Because peace built on silence will always collapse under the first whisper of truth. So he called on nations not to pick sides, but to pick standards. He called on youth not just to learn history, but to write it. He called on leaders not just to protect borders, but to protect belief. The belief that a small nation is not a weak nation, that power is not measured in missiles, but in meaning, and that truth is not a threat but a torch. He said we must stop managing our dignity, we must start defending it. And if that message spreads, if one voice becomes many, then the empires built on manipulation will crack, not from bombs, but from awakening. That is what Traoré understands. Empires don't fall when you fight them. They fall when you see through them. And right now, millions are beginning to see. From Accra to Bamako, from Nairobi to Johannesburg. A new sound is rising, not of sirens, but of sovereignty. Young people turning off foreign news and tuning into local truth. Communities refusing donations with strings. Artists creating songs, film sermons about liberation, not assimilation. Elders whispering again the names of ancestors, once erased from memory. This is what the powerful fear, not rebellion, but remembering. Because when a people remember who they are, they become ungovernable by lies. So now I turn to you, wherever you are in the world, whatever flag waves above your home. Ask yourself, are you watching history or shaping it? Because silence may feel safe. It may feel neutral, but it always serves someone. And when it serves the powerful, it starves the rest. Traoré didn't ask for pity. He asked for clarity. Do you see the double standards? Do you see the price of obedience dressed as peace? Do you see the countries being erased, not with tanks, but with contracts and media spin? If so, then this is not just a video, it's a call. Drop a comment. New Africa if you believe a different future is possible. Share this video not for the views, but for the vision. Because maybe, just maybe, this is the moment we stop whispering and start roaring. Do you believe in Traoré? Do you believe that when we speak truth, God listens and shields? Then don't scroll past. Stand, speak, share. Because the future isn't written by the loudest, it's written by the most courageous. And Africa is writing again. Some battles are not fought with bullets, and some wars do not leave behind ruins. They leave behind silence. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, standing tall as missiles rained down on Iran, while Burkina Faso burned under invisible pressure, is more than a political moment. It is a mirror to every African nation. A reminder that in the 21st century, Africa's greatest enemy may no longer wear armor, but offer aid, loans, and silence. As an African, I do not see Traoré as a savior. I see him as a signal. That freedom is not found in waving a flag, but in daring to speak when the world demands silence. When Israel struck Iranian nuclear sites with no warning, the global community did not react. When Burkina Faso was being buried under debt surveillance disguised as cooperation and externally funded disinformation, there were no statements of concern. And that is the problem. Justice does not always die in explosions. Sometimes it dies in polite silence. Traoré understood something that most post-colonial nations are beginning to realize. In modern warfare, the first target is truth. And the new weapons are not tanks or fighter jets, but contracts, bank transfers, and partnerships written in foreign languages. In his clarity, Traoré showed Africa that we are no longer invaded by force, we are consumed by compliance. The first lesson for Africa is this: invasion has evolved. The colonizer no longer knocks with a rifle, he knocks with a proposal. He offers grants, scholarships, infrastructure, always with invisible strings. Traoré saw this, and instead of smiling and signing like many before him, he said no. He cut off deals that poisoned national dignity. He expelled those who wore the badge of cooperation but acted as agents of surveillance. He drew a red line. We will not sell our future for applause. As an African, I felt that in my bones. We have had too many agreements that benefit everyone but us. Too many development partners who profit from our poverty. Too many leaders who manage dignity instead of defending it. Traoré's actions remind us Africa does not need pity. Africa needs permission from itself to rise. The second lesson is about trust. For decades, our people have learned not to trust their governments, their media, or even their own voice. When Traoré stepped forward, he didn't promise miracles. He told hard truths. He said your enemy might not wear a uniform. It might wear a suit. It might build your roads while burying your voice. He didn't ask us to prepare for war. He asked us to see clearly. That is revolutionary. Because in Africa, many revolutions are performed on stages, loud slogans, flag waving, and symbolic arrests. But Traoré's revolution was different. It started in the soul. It asked people not just to protest, but to stand. Not just to demand change, but to become it. That is what frightened the powerful. Not his military, but his message. The third lesson is about leadership. Traoré didn't demand loyalty, he inspired it. He didn't build a cult. He broke a curse, the curse of waiting for foreign validation. He looked his people in the eye and asked one simple question. Do you believe in your own voice? For many Africans, this is the most dangerous question of all. Because if we do believe, truly believe, then no amount of manipulation, no amount of foreign aid, no amount of silence can hold us down again. Traoré did not just speak for Burkina Faso. He spoke for every nation being devoured behind closed doors. He spoke for the voiceless, the betrayed, the silenced. And he said something many fear to say, we don't need to be saved, we need to be respected. That is the essence of sovereignty, not just independence from colonial rule, but independence of thought, policy, and purpose. The final lesson, and perhaps the most powerful, is about peace. Traoré redefined it. He told us if peace means accepting injustice in silence, then it is not peace, it is surrender. If sovereignty means begging for loans while losing your land, then it is not sovereignty, it is economic slavery. And if diplomacy means watching your people suffer in exchange for foreign approval, then diplomacy has failed. Traoré chose clarity over comfort, truth over tradition, conviction over compliance. He reminded Africa that we were never poor, we were made to feel poor. That our children are not failures, they are victims of systems never designed for them to succeed. That our history did not begin with colonization and will not end in exploitation. And above all, he reminded us that we already have everything we need: our people, our land, our faith, and our voice. We do not need to become Europe. We do not need to become China. We need to become ourselves, whole, unafraid, and awake. As an African, I do not celebrate Traoré as a hero. I honor him as a mirror showing us both our scars and our power. And in that reflection, I do not see weakness. I see the rising. I see a continent shaking off the dust of lies. I see youth who no longer want visas but visions. I see mothers and fathers saying, "We were not wrong to dream." I see elders whispering, "This is what we waited for." And I see enemies afraid not of war, but of truth spoken boldly from small nations. Because in the end, missiles destroy buildings, but ideas, they dismantle empires. So let us not be silent. Let us not trade clarity for comfort. Let us not apologize for our sovereignty. Let us not forget the world is not threatened by our weakness, but by the day we finally believe in our strength. And that day is coming. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood against the quiet tide of manipulation sweeping across Africa, he was not merely resisting foreign powers, he was resisting a mindset. A mindset that told African nations they were too poor to lead themselves, too unstable to govern without supervision, too small to dream beyond their borders. But Traoré shattered that illusion not with arrogance, but with audacity. He proved that leadership does not require wealth. It requires will. He did not have nuclear weapons or global alliances, but he had clarity. And in a world buried in lies, clarity is revolutionary. It exposes the strings behind the aid, the agenda behind the media, the profit behind the partnerships. And once the veil is lifted, it can never be put back. As an African, I saw something in Traoré that I hadn't seen in years: a leader who was not afraid to be disliked by the powerful. A man who valued truth more than approval. That is rare. Because most of our leaders, even those with revolutionary rhetoric, eventually bend. They host summits, shake hands, sign loans, and sell promises they cannot keep. But Traoré chose a different path, one filled with sacrifice. And that's another lesson Africa must remember. True sovereignty has a cost. It may cost you allies. It may cost you funding. It may even cost you safety. But the alternative, dependency, silence, humiliation, costs far more. Traoré taught us that it is better to walk alone with dignity than to be carried by those who mock your freedom. What makes his stance more profound is that he didn't just preach independence, he practiced it. When he expelled foreign military advisors, many said he was reckless. When he cut ties with banks, imposing unfair conditions, they called him unstable. When he restructured his army from the ground up, removing foreign-trained officers with conflicted loyalties, they called him paranoid. But the people, they called him brave. And that is the real battlefield, not between nations, but between narratives. In today's Africa, wars are fought through headlines, not tanks. A president can be destroyed not by an assassin's bullet, but by a breaking news story carefully timed and globally echoed. Traoré understood this. That's why he didn't just reform policy, he reformed perception. He reclaimed the story of Burkina Faso from foreign editors and gave it back to the people. And once a nation begins to tell its own story, it becomes dangerous to those who profit from its silence. The ripple effect of his leadership is now undeniable. From Mali to Guinea, Niger to Chad, a new language is emerging, one not written in colonial grammar, but in ancestral rhythm. African youth are no longer ashamed of their traditions. They are reviving them. Farmers are no longer waiting for foreign experts. They are innovating locally. Artists are no longer copying Western trends. They are creating with pride and purpose. This is what Traoré ignited, not a rebellion of violence, but a renaissance of vision. It is no coincidence that countries rejecting foreign interference are the same ones being labeled as unstable. That is not truth, it is strategy. The more we reclaim our dignity, the more we are framed as dangerous. But perhaps the real danger is not Traoré. Perhaps the real threat to the world order is an Africa that no longer asks permission. Because when we stop asking, we start building. When we stop obeying, we start organizing. When we stop apologizing, we start advancing. And suddenly the empire trembles, not from revolt, but from renewal. But let's not romanticize this too much. Traoré's path is not easy. He is targeted. He is surveilled. He is threatened. And he knows this. But he continues not because he is fearless, but because he is faithful. Faithful to the people who trusted him, to the future that has been denied for too long. To the idea that Africa deserves more than survival, it deserves sovereignty. And for that, he may never be celebrated by the international elite, but he will be remembered by history. As an African, I believe the question is no longer whether we support leaders like Traoré, but whether we are ready to walk with them, not as followers, but as co-builders, not just in words, but in action. Do we support local economies even when foreign goods seem cheaper? Do we challenge foreign narratives even when our own media is bought and paid for? Do we teach our children their true history, not as victims but as visionaries? Because the revolution Traoré began is not his to finish. It belongs to all of us. We must build institutions that outlive the man. We must craft policies that defend the land. We must raise children who no longer see exile as success, but staying home and transforming it as honor. We must stop surviving systems built to break us and start building systems rooted in who we are. That is the lesson Traoré gave to Africa, not just through speeches, but through sacrifice. He showed us that dignity is dangerous, but silence is worse. And so I speak not to praise the man, but to protect the moment. This is our turning point, not just for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa. Let the world label us. Let them misunderstand us. Let them fear our clarity. Because we now know a continent that sees itself clearly cannot be conquered. A people that speaks its own truth cannot be silenced. and a future shaped by its rightful heirs cannot be bought. This is not just a political shift, it is a spiritual reawakening. And if we follow it not with violence but with vision, we will not only change our fate, we will change the world. What Traoré sparked in Burkina Faso is no longer a moment, it is a movement. A movement not confined by borders or limited by language. From Lagos to Lusaka, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, there is a quiet hum becoming a roar, not one of anger but of awareness. Africa is remembering that we once governed vast empires without aid, that our ancestors mapped stars, built cities, healed bodies and governed communities long before colonizers drew lines on a map, that our identity is not a burden but a blueprint. And as the world tries to reset its balance through force, Africa is discovering a different kind of power, the power to define. To define what leadership looks like, not as polished puppets of the West, but as accountable servants of the people. To define what development means, not GDP figures approved by foreign banks, but water in the villages, education rooted in relevance and justice that reflects our values. To define what peace means, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of dignity. Traoré is not the first to walk this path, but he walks it in a time when eyes are open, cameras are rolling, and truth spreads faster than bullets. He has reminded us that the most radical thing a small nation can do is think for itself. And so we must ask, what are we doing with this awakening? Will we return to business as usual? Or will we build institutions that outlive charisma? Will we let fear silence us? Or will we organize in our communities, classrooms, and cultures? Will we continue to react to the world, or finally shape it because the world is watching? Not to celebrate us, but to see if we dare to believe that the continent of kings, queens, scholars, and seers still exists beneath the dust of colonization. Traoré did not start this fire, he merely exposed the spark that was already inside us. And now it is our turn to protect it, with courage, with clarity, with unity. Let our generation be remembered not as the one who complained, but as the one who rebuilt. Not as victims of empire, but as authors of a new future. Not as imitators, but as initiators of a civilization reawakened. Because the greatest threat to power is a people who remember who they are. And Africa finally is beginning to remember. And for that, he may never be celebrated by the international elite, but he will be remembered by history. As an African, I believe the question is no longer whether we support leaders like Traoré, but whether we are ready to walk with them, not as followers, but as co-builders, not just in words, but in action. Do we support local economies even when foreign goods seem cheaper? Do we challenge foreign narratives even when our own media is bought and paid for? Do we teach our children their true history, not as victims, but as visionaries? Because the revolution Traoré began is not his to finish. It belongs to all of us. We must build institutions that outlive the man. We must craft policies that defend the land. We must raise children who no longer see exile as success, but staying home and transforming it as honor. We must stop surviving systems built to break us and start building systems rooted in who we are. That is the lesson Traoré gave to Africa, not just through speeches, but through sacrifice. He showed us that dignity is dangerous, but silence is worse. And so I speak not to praise the man, but to protect the moment. This is our turning point, not just for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa. Let the world label us. Let them misunderstand us. Let them fear our clarity. Because we now know a continent that sees itself clearly cannot be conquered. A people that speaks its own truth cannot be silenced. And a future shaped by its rightful heirs cannot be bought. This is not just a political shift. It is a spiritual reawakening. And if we follow it not with violence, but with vision, we will not only change our fate, we will change the world. What Traoré sparked in Burkina Faso is no longer a moment, it is a movement not confined by borders or limited by language. From Lagos to Lusaka, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, there is a quiet hum becoming a roar, not one of anger but of awareness. Africa is remembering that we once governed vast empires without aid, that our ancestors mapped stars, built cities, healed bodies and governed communities long before colonizers drew lines on a map, that our identity is not a burden but a blueprint. And as the world tries to reset its balance through force, Africa is discovering a different kind of power, the power to define. To define what leadership looks like, not as polished puppets of the West, but as accountable servants of the people. To define what development means, not GDP figures approved by foreign banks, but water in the villages, education rooted in relevance and justice that reflects our values. To define what peace means, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of dignity. Traoré is not the first to walk this path, but he walks it in a time when eyes are open, cameras are rolling, and truth spreads faster than bullets. He has reminded us that the most radical thing a small nation can do is think for itself. And so we must ask, what are we doing with this awakening? Will we return to business as usual? Or will we build institutions that outlive charisma? Will we let fear silence us? Or will we organize in our communities, classrooms, and cultures? Will we continue to react to the world, or finally shape it because the world is watching? Not to celebrate us, but to see if we dare to believe that the continent of kings, queens, scholars, and seers still exists beneath the dust of colonization. Traoré did not start this fire, he merely exposed the spark that was already inside us, and now